Christian, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Do you want to just start by telling us a little bit about you and your business?
Sure. So I've been doing legal software now for 35 years. We specialise in small law firms around the world, and we mostly just try and help them be more productive so that they can do a better job providing legal services to small businesses and individuals.
And when did that come about? You've been doing this for 35 years. Obviously, the industry's changed a lot over that time, but what was the genesis of starting the business?
Well, my father had a small law firm in Parramatta in Australia, and he wrote his own system actually, and then he had a person there looking after that system, and that person left. And the first thing he did was ring my brother and offered him a job to look after him, but when he said no, he rang me second, and I said yes, and I've been doing that since then.
Why did you say yes?
Look, I probably didn't have a lot of other options, to be honest. Any job I got offered, there was any kind of significance.
In your background, I've read that you were self-taught, self-made. You were going into a little bit about that part of the early stage of the journey.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, when I say I was self-taught, I think I didn't go to university at all. I didn't do all that well at school, so I probably didn't really have many university options. And so I kind of ended up becoming interested in programming pretty much when very few people were. Because what was sort of happening, I was interested in computers and I was playing around with my dad's computers at night. So that gave me a bit of experience. So when he had that need, he offered me the job. He then sort of paid someone to tutor me a little bit on programming. But realistically, most programming, I think, is really self-taught effectively, because even if you go to university or something, what happens is your real learning is when you're playing around yourself trying to get to work. And I did a lot of that for a lot of years. I used to spend probably about 6 hours a day, 6 days a week for about 12 years programming, and that kind of helped me become good at it in those early years.
It's learn by doing, right?
That's right, yeah. The rate of learning, I personally find the rate of learning is faster on the job than in formal education. So I think that was a lot of learning back then.
And is that because you can do things at your own pace, right? You don't have to, it's not like with a bunch of other people, or if there's a structure around it where you spend too much time on a certain thing, when you're ready to go to the next thing that you're interested in, you do it.
Yeah, look, what I think with business is that if you're filling voids and solving problems and working in a business, you learn on a whole lot of factors, right? So I think that learning is pretty fast if you put in, you're in a situation where you've got pressure and you've got things you got to fix. You tend to learn a lot faster than I think in a formal education format where you are sort of running through a course that may or may not be that relevant anymore, or with sort of other things that waste time in that sort of format of learning.
Yeah. So how old were you when you first started learning programming, or how old were you when you first started learning to program? And then how old were you when you started the business from that perspective, working in that role?
Well, I was about 19 when I started programming. And what happened was I was working in a company and I was in a sales job selling hydraulic components, and it was very manual in those days, where someone would ring up and want to buy 100 O-rings, and I would go out to the storeroom and actually count how many O-rings we had. I would go in there and look up a manual price list and tell them what the price is, and then I would handwrite out the order form, and it was all manual. So my dad was quite into computers and my brother was quite into computers, and I actually wasn't. But when I saw how hard work that was manually, I kind of then thought, well, really it's obvious that that's the way to do it. And then I became very interested, and I have been ever since.
And at what point did you realize you had a business that not only could be successful, but you could scale?
Well, really what happened is I rewrote my dad's system and then started selling to other law firms, and that took a long time. Like, it probably took 15 years of hard work before I really realised really I had a viable business, and I didn't ever think it would scale that well. Like, my original objective was to conquer Australia. I didn't ever think we'd sort of conquer the world with it. But I think that once you've achieved one objective, it's normal, I think, for you tend to flow into other objectives. So I probably would say I never thought it would go as well as it has, to be honest.
And in talking about in terms of as well as it has, do you want to just give us a little bit of a snapshot of where the business is at today in terms of the size and scale and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so we have revenue of about $1 billion in our legal businesses, and they are the biggest in the world in small law firms. We're very strong in Australia, the UK. We're sort of merging into the US, Canada, New Zealand, Ireland, those sort of countries. So I think our core strength is Australia and UK, but we're growing in a lot of other countries as well.
And in terms of when you say you didn't think it would be as big as it has become, when you were building the software and those types of things in the early stages of the business, but was from an ambition point of view, was that something that you wanted to achieve, or what was the sort of the objective from the early stages?
Look, I think my very early stages, I didn't do very well at school, and I wasn't very self-confident. And I think that when I started programming, I thought this could be useful, and I desperately wanted to be useful. I desperately wanted to have success that I think could sort of prove that my academic failings weren't the complete way the world viewed me, I suppose. So
Yeah.
my early years was just to kind of do that sort of thing. And I was very happy to get, law firms using the software, and I was very happy to have it grow, and I was very happy to have it get into a position where it could dominate Australia, and that was very exciting to me for a long time. And I kind of had a bit of a midlife crisis. That had happened, and did a few other things for a while, but I was lucky enough that I had other people that could continue that global growth, and that worked out very well for me, actually.
When you say a midlife crisis along the way, you're talking about sort of distractions from the core business that let people do that, or what was? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that side of things?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think what happened is that I started off young, like about 19, 20 years old, and I worked very, very hard for probably 25 years, and it was very, very difficult. Like we funded no money, very little investment, and it was very, very painful and difficult. And I think I kind of enjoyed that and responded well to that pressure. But funny enough, when we got to the point where things were going really well, I kind of got a little bit bored and a little bit depressed, I actually think. And I was also making decisions that I figured was perhaps not the best for the business. It was kind of at this stage where everything was going really well, and I knew the best thing to do was to do nothing strategically and just let it grow, because the valuation was going to go up a lot and let it grow. But I had a bit of trouble doing nothing. So I kind of realized that I needed to probably either remove some of the senior executive in the business and me take that role over, or I need to myself get out of the business. And I decided on the latter. So I kind of got out of the business and got into some interesting technology in camera systems and what I perceive to be a growing market, which is kind of at the time mobile cloud camera systems, a combination of those technologies, which later morphed into AI usage and later morphed into face rec and those sorts of technologies.
What was the biggest learning that you got out of that personally? And that's probably a very personal answer, I guess. But in terms of, it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but you've been pushing for many years to succeed, and you've had a goal to get there. And when you get there, it sounds like it's probably really difficult transition to deal with, actually getting to the top of the mountain. The next question is, how do you stay there? And I mean, that happens across business and sport and all sorts of fields. Is that something in hindsight you would have done ahead of time, knowing what you know now? Or was it something that you just had to go through a process?
Well, I think probably what happened to me was that when I left the business, what happened is that I had some very good people reporting to me. We had a few business divisions. We had 2 legal software companies, and we had a legal searching company, and very good people running each of those. So what I kind of decided was to split the company into 3 and put each of those people as CEOs of those individual companies. So we split the businesses up. And then I sort of ended up as the board member or chairman initially. And then I went and did other things the rest of the time. But really what happened was that proved to be very effective because the kind of a few things, I think those people that I promoted to CEOs did very well with that, and they enjoyed it. They produced much better results. But also what I sort of found was by splitting companies up, they were kind of more valuable separately than they were together. Partly because some of them were making money, some of them were pre-profit stage, etc. When we split them out, they're a bit easier for investors to understand. So if you value each of them individually, they're more valuable than if you put it all together. She's at one conglomerate but made no money. That did work really well for a lot of years, actually, that separation. But it did start to change a little bit later, where I think things like AI would come in for legal. And also I think that while I think separations worked really well, there was some sort of changes in the technology that meant working more closely together became kind of needed. So then I ended up sort of coming back into the role. And unfortunately, the second biggest business, which is legal, I had a really good person running it for a long time, but unfortunately he got terminal cancer. And he had to leave that job very, very quickly. And I took over as CEO about a year ago. And I'm really enjoying the job. And the good thing about it is a lot of AI in it. And I sort of have a lot of experience on AI externally, which I'm really enjoying applying to legal. And I think it's been a very useful, it'll be very, very transformational if the legal industry to have AI properly integrated.
I was going to ask, in terms of AI, how big do you think the opportunity is, and how transformational is it, not just for the legal industry, but all industries?
Well, what I'd probably say, if you look at small law firms, I think it's one of the industries where it's most transformational. And the reason for that is if you look at what they do, like things like, for example, something like family law, right? Family law is court system in Australia is a very, very good system. It's very, very fair, and it considers every aspect in its decisions. But the problem is it's very, very expensive and very, very slow. And so most people don't have the money and the time to deal with it. And that means that ultimately kind of is quite unfair because people are forced to make compromise, particularly if they're short of money. So where I think AI can improve that is to make it a lot more efficient and a lot faster, and therefore a lot fairer and a lot more accessible to a lot more people. And I'm very excited to sort of be involved in that kind of transition.
And I mean, it is a massive opportunity. Do you think industries and businesses really understand it yet? Because in my mind, from a share market point of view and looking at where that's all going, there's aspects where people really understand it, but in day-to-day life, I don't think people really appreciate that. It's not necessarily a fad at all. It's a game changer.
I agree. Look, I personally think most people don't understand how significant it will be. And I sort of consider myself almost like an AI evangelist, persuading our internal businesses to take AI and how powerful it can be. So I'm probably far more into it than most people are, even in our own companies. And I think that most people probably don't realise the very, very significant, largely positive impacts I think it can have.
Yep. From a business perspective, what are the key things that you see that you had in terms of over those 35 years from when you started that have been mainstays in the way that you've gone about business?
Well, probably what I'd say is when I started a long time ago in Australia, the market for tech companies was very, very poor. In other words, most people didn't really know anything about technology. They didn't really consider it to have a big impact on something like law firm. It was very hard to get investment or borrow money in those early years. So I think probably we had to learn to live with that environment, and we've done some things that are very, very different to most other tech companies. The main one is that we funded our growth through debt, whereas most people fund it through equity. And there's a very, very big difference between those parts. There's pros and cons, but we've kind of very much gone down the debt funding path, which is, I think, pretty unique, actually.
Yeah, I mean, very common in the software and the tech space is you go down that venture capital path and away you go. And there's a very formulaic pathway there for many businesses these days, probably not so much 15 and 20 years ago, but definitely more so in the last 5, 10, 15 years. The big downside of that is obviously you give away a lot of equity. you get the funding, but there's other risks that go with taking on debt. So what was your mindset in terms of, did you consider that to be taking on more risk, or how did you perceive that as you were going down that debt path more so than the equity path?
Look, I think probably in the early days when we had a whole lot of competitors that also had no money. So when I started in legal software, there's probably about 25 companies in Australia. None of them had much money. And there was one large provider, I suppose they had a bit of money, but most other people didn't. And so back in those days, I used to think, well, if I could borrow money, it cost me about 20% per annum, I could get a far better return than 20%. And I kind of went with the approach of borrowing money at those, what I consider pretty high interest rates. But I found that we could get a really good return for shareholders by doing that. And that was in a range of areas like research, development, sales and marketing, acquisitions. So we did it a few ways. What the problem was back then, no one would lend you money. But what we found is that software companies were considered, or technology companies, high risk. Like back in those days, you had a lot of computer shops going broke. Banks would consider anything to do with computers, and it was all risky in their mindset, right? But they always found law firms very stable, and they were very happy to lend to law firms. So we ended up coming up with a formula where we essentially got the law firm to take out a loan to buy our software. We got prepaid for 3 years of that software use, and it cost about 15% or maybe 20% all up. But we had that funding capability, and no one else did, and that helped us become number one in Australia. And we used to also do acquisitions with vendor finance. Again, we were paying, around about 15, maybe 20% interest on the acquisitions. But again, we found that was very effective for us, and it helped us become number one.
Some people might be uncomfortable with some of that, but if I look at what you were talking about, you're using debt to fund the growth of the business, and you're actually locking in your customers at the same time for the next 3 years. And if they're in for 3 years, they're probably going to be in for a fair bit longer. So it seems to be a pretty smart strategy.
Yeah, look, I think it worked really well for us. The main reason is we were very cash focused. A lot of companies, tech companies, they're kind of trying to sell the investment stories. What they aspire to is creating a good story. Whereas what we always needed to do was persuade good quality clients to make a long-term commitment to our software. So what that meant was that the leasing company wouldn't give the law firm a loan unless they were a good quality law firm. Yeah. Good quality law firm wouldn't sign a 3-year contract unless they were taking the software seriously. So that kind of forced us to really focus on that, and that focus on getting firms to make big commitment to our software, make sure that software worked well for them. And it was so compelling that they'd sign a 3-year contract and they'd be taking it a loan. It was all hard, but very, very valuable, because it kind of forced us to be really focused on getting good clients, getting lots of them. The more we sold, the more money we had to grow, and the more money, we're always desperate to employ people and make product better, etc. And having sales as our only way of delivering that was very, very influential on how we thought about things around the business. We didn't really care about investors. We didn't really care too much about shareholders. All we cared about was selling, and that makes us very effective.
And so from a growth perspective, you've obviously had steady and rapid growth at different points along the line. What were some of the tougher times that you faced and challenges along that sort of multi-decade time frame?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest challenge was globalization, because we had a model, we were making a lot of money in Australia. And I think what happened is that most investors and lenders are very skeptical of Australian companies expanding overseas. And what I found was very difficult is that to sort of like talk to anyone about overseas expansion, they would tend to mark that down as being like say for instance, you're spending $20 million a year on your overseas expansion, they would basically mean that you were 20 mil less profitable, so you'd be less valuable if you did nothing, you just stayed in Australia. That I found very challenging. And the way we sort of got around that in the end was to separate our businesses out. So we separated out our really profitable Australian company from our riskier offshore ventures, and we're able to borrow money against our Australian business, distribute to shareholders that allowed those shareholders to then invest in these offshore ventures. And then when those offshore ventures became profitable, we would get the Australian company to buy those overseas businesses, and those proceeds that went to shareholders could be reinvested in further offshore expansion in other countries. So we kind of came up with a model that I think is unique, but it did work well for us.
It's obviously a very unique model and it worked. But did you look at it sometimes and think it seems unnecessary that you should have to do that simply because some other people are more conservative in their mindset because they don't think global, they think local? Or did you think it was justified?
Look, I often wonder between debt and equity. Like, there has been some very successful companies that have raised equity and done very well. And I often wonder whether I would have been better down the equity path or the debt path. But I think we're down the debt path now, and I think I'm happy with it. Like, there's a lot of good things about it. Like, firstly, when you run a company that's spun by equity, the investors tend to worry about lots of things, right? And you have a lot of issues around board control and things like that. I think when you're debt funded, the debt funders predominantly just worry about your profitability, which is easier. And there's also no real, because there's no dilution, there's no real board control issues. Like, I have about 60% generally of the companies that I'm involved in. So I don't ever have to worry about what control issues, which I think often cause a lot of issues in companies. So there's pros and cons, but I'm probably more comfortable with the debt path than the equity path.
Yeah. And that autonomy side of things is a massive issue that anyone I talk to, whether it's clients or people that come on the show have built big businesses, the autonomy, the flexibility, investors or not, is a really big issue. And people who are successful tend to be fairly strong-willed, value their autonomy and freedom. And you often see it when they actually exit more so, where, for the next 1 to 3 years, they've sold off the business and they're now working under a different sort of arrangement. And the autonomy's gone. There's a bureaucracy and all these different things, which is usually worth it because they exited and whatever it might be. But those issues are a really big deal. And I think underestimated in many respects when people sometimes blindly go down the path of equity when they might not even these days consider how to use debt.
Yes. Well, I agree with that. I mean, I think if you look at sort of founder-led companies, a lot of them do very well when the control is very clear, right? And it's often achieved with Class A, Class B shares in a NASDAQ listed company or something like that. But it's various ways of getting there. But I think that if you've got most founders, I think if they've got clear control, it does generally produce a pretty good result. And it's certainly, as a founder, very nice to be in that position where you don't have to always be worried about board votes and things like that. It takes a lot of mental energy to worry about that sort of stuff if you don't have that control.
And in terms of the industry itself, how has that changed most dramatically in the last sort of 10, 20, 30 years that you've noticed?
Well, look, I think it's just the start of it, but I think AI is going to have a massive impact, and that's by far the biggest change I've ever seen. Because if you look at really what happened from a tech point of view, we started off originally doing database systems, automating forms, client-server technology. The next big transition was to cloud, and that was pretty significant. But realistically, it made it easy to work from home. It was great during the pandemic, and it kind of reduced IT costs a lot, and it increased security. You didn't get people losing data and things like that. But if you look at AI revolutionized it. Like, if you look at law, one really common example is producing affidavits. If you've ever been in a court case, the amount of time in producing affidavits, which is really a story about the evidence, you could say, that storytelling is really, really laborious for lawyers to go through and look at all the details across a whole lot of sources, write up a story, fact check it, etc. It's really hard work. It's the kind of thing that AI is awesome at. And when we show a lawyer an AI generated first draft of an affidavit, they don't kind of go, well, that doesn't look right, or I don't like this or that, they kind of go, well, how am I going to charge for that? Because that used to take me 3 days and it now takes 10 minutes.
It's a conundrum, right?
Well, it's also quite revolutionary because if you look at what we used to do, where we used to do things like automated forms, an automated form might save you 20 minutes, right? But an automated affidavit will save you 3 days, right? So it's sort of like radically different in terms of the impact it's going to have. It hasn't happened yet, but it will happen.
But that's revolutionary. And just because it might be confusing as to how to charge for it, given how they used to charge it, doesn't mean that new entrants aren't going to come in and change the way things are built, because you can't felt productivity increases that are going to come from saving the time on those types of things. So it's going to upend a lot of that part of the industry simply because of the time saved. And that's across all industries, not just law. I think it's fascinating to see how that's starting to play out.
No, I agree. And I think what I would say to you too is, if you look at something like the family court, most people can't afford to deal with it. And you can make it so that more people can afford it, get more fair outcomes. I think the lawyers are also going to be fine because they'll still be able to charge their hourly rates or longer hourly rates, but the end client will get a lot better value for money, because if you've got a lawyer being paid by the hour, if their productivity goes up dramatically, then you're going to get better value for money. So the whole thing is good. It's just a matter of sort of getting transitioning to kind of a cure, which is obviously something we're very interested in doing.
I think the other part of that, but just to finish up on that, I guess, is a lot of people, when they see some examples of where AI is not working so great right now, they sort of look at it and go, oh yeah, see, it doesn't do that, or that. They'll sort of mock something. You see that sometimes where people will say, oh, look, it still does that, or does this mistake or that mistake. What people, I think, would do well to remember is that this is its earliest stage and it's never going to be out, and this stuff learns. And every year you're going to see exponential growth and change in the way it does this. So the things that it might struggle to do now, in a year, 2 years, 3 years, will become basic tasks for AI. And I think people forget the trajectory of the growth and improvement that's going to come from some of these systems.
I agree with that. Also, bear in mind, humans make more mistakes too. I think, look, a lot of what we do is work around the weaknesses that I have. Like, we do a lot with AI-powered legal research. Like, we use humans to verify the answers and improve the answers and teach the AI. We sort of check links to cases that make sure they're real. We're doing a lot of things to kind of make the AI more accurate, because that is its weakness. The problem with it is that it's very good at giving an answer for everything, but it doesn't know or care whether that answer is right. And we do a lot to fix that. But if you look at what tends to happen with AI, if you feed it information, amazing. So for a law firm, just feeding it its own legal matter and asking it questions, and those questions do very common. Write me a letter, draft an affidavit, tell me if this is a problem, likely to be a problem. It's very good at that because you feed it the whole matter. You can feed it all research material around the subject matter, and it's likely to give you very, very good insights that would take you so much time to do manually. It's not funny. You're just reading, research, reading, and realistically, no one has time to read. Some of these legal matters, might have 30,000 documents on it. No one has time to read it. But AI can read all of that, and you can ask it questions, which is imminently more powerful than sort of trying to do it manually.
And that kind of stuff's quite mind-blowing in terms of being able to have it assess something that's so large and distill from it the details you need specifically. And I think even that in itself is quite revolutionary.
Oh, exactly. Like, the simple thing is, you might be a new lawyer. You've never really dealt with a file. There's 32,000 documents. It'll take you 2 months to read it all. And you want to know, did the father help look after the kids when they're young? You could say to the AI, draft me affidavit clause which taught the fact that the father helped look after the kids when they're young. It'll do a beautiful job of that. You can also go the other way, draft me affidavits clauses to support the fact that the father didn't help look after the kids when they were young. It could give the reverse argument. You compare those two. Those sort of things, if you had to do that manual and read all the material, it would take you months or weeks. But I think that AI could do that pretty quickly, pretty easily, and it will show you the sources so you can verify whether you agree with its assessments. But it's kind of, yeah, you're crazy to do it. And
Yeah, these days, I know it's like not using a calculator, that type of thing. Once upon a time, people might have looked at that, that's not doing it properly. But these days there's lots of systems, whether it's a computer or whatever it is that you use, because it just makes so much sense. And you might get a little bit of pushback from people who might be a purist in whatever reason, but it doesn't make sense in the end. And the technology and the productivity overwhelms in the end. It's a no-brainer.
yeah, we show lots of lawyers, and there's not much against it. And if anyone's against it, we just say, look, don't use it.
Be left behind.
The big guy, right? Very easy.
Exactly right. I want to ask a little bit about teamwork and culture and leadership, but I want to get to the business side. But you've also been involved in the city to Hobart.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in, firstly, how you got involved in that in the first place, and how that's analogous in terms of a team that works towards winning something like that, and how that compares to a leadership group within business.
Sure. Look, I first got into it about 8 or 9 years ago, and I thought I'd learned to be a good sailor and be a big part of the team. But what I fairly quickly learned is that the guys that are really good on the Sydney Hobart have done a Volvo around the world ocean race. They're the kind of people that used to doing 5,000 miles across the Southern Ocean, and they just think that the Sydney Hobart's an overnighter. And if you work in an office like I do, you can't actually compete with that.
That's a different world.
That's right. So I've got this guy, Tony Mutter, who runs it all, and he's an excellent guy in so many ways. Like, what I've learned, the best thing for me to do is pretty much nothing, or really nothing. And it's a little bit like if you're chairman of a company and you've got a really good CEO, right? I think my assessment there is to do almost nothing is the best thing to do there, right? If you've got a great CEO, obviously you want to be around in case the CEO loses track, or you need to, gets run by a bus or whatever. So you've got a role, but largely doing nothing is hard to do, but important. So in the Sydney Hobart, like last year, I got on Boxing Day. I did nothing the whole race, and we won.
Well done.
And our boat is sort of like nowhere near as good as Comanche. But I think that, as opposed to a lot of people in the sailing world, that's actually quite good, because most people in my position will want to sail a boat, you want to get involved, and that will impact the professional sailors and their capacity to win. And that's partially why I think our boat, way worse than Comanche, but can beat Comanche, because doing nothing was probably the best thing to do. So that probably gives you a fair view on my assessment of having great people. And if you can lucky enough to find great people, really being supportive and actually not doing a lot is actually the best thing you can do, in my view.
I mean, that sounds so simple, but it's relatively rare to hear that. Now, I totally understand it. It makes complete sense. But I don't think everyone's able to do that, because part of having ambition and wanting to do things is doing sometimes. And so and I see it with people who are investors, where they've sold a business and they want to manage their money. They're used to making decisions and doing things, when sometimes in the investment world, doing nothing is actually the best option, being passive and being patient and letting things just do what they do and buy the right investments and hold them. People who have been in business don't tend to do that well, because they're used to making decisions and acting quickly and doing all that. So sometimes it's the different mindset. It's a similar type of thing that you're talking about there, where it's a learned skill, I imagine, to trust, and I guess it's trust, and be patient and recognize that you've got the right people and let them do what they want to do. Is that what it is? Is it trust, or what do you put it down to?
Look, I think it's quite a bit of self-discipline, actually, because when something's going well, it's very much human nature to want to be involved and want to be seen to be involved, and therefore take over and often undermine those that are really the important ones. So I think an example of this in the Hobart, I think Tony Muller does a fantastic job. He runs the whole team. He does really everything with the team he employs. And I do next to nothing. The only thing I do is I support him, actually. But that's quite important, right? Giving consistent support. And it's not just last year, it's a number of years, like the last, I think, 5 Hobarts. Tony's been running it and I've been supporting him, and it wasn't until last year that we won. But I think that it's really, I think a lot of it, it's hard to do, actually. I find it hard to do nothing. It's hard to sit on that boat and do nothing. It'd be a lot easier to grab the steering wheel and steer for 4 hours. I think.
Yeah, yeah.
But we wouldn't last year if I did that.
Yeah, but I think that's a fascinating. I mean, Warren Buffett's a little bit like that in terms of his approach to an investment perspective. He buys great businesses and lets the management do what they do. And we sort of touched on that theme where you talked about putting in 3 different CEOs across the business, going back a little while, and let them have the autonomy to build those businesses or do what they had to do, and that it created different benefits. But I don't imagine that it's easy, and the self-discipline aspect makes complete sense when you say that, because there's something about human nature, like you say, where you want to do things, improve things, and sometimes you just got to get out of the way and let people do what they do best. Easier said than done.
Yeah, look, I think part of it too is like you need to be secure to do that. Like if you're insecure, you'll tend to want to exaggerate your role and last thing. But I think being the majority shareholder and having complete control, no one's going to kick me out, so I can kind of be secure. Like, for example, we've got a business, InfoTrack, that's been run by a guy called Stephen Wood for a long time. He's the equivalent of, say, Tony Mutter in Michelle World. Like, he does a great job running InfoTrack. It's always done really well. And all I really do is support him. And we argue a little bit on strategy. Subject matter I know a fair bit about. So we argue a fair bit about strategy in a sort of constructive way, I think. But he's completely in control. I would never undermine his authority. But I can sort of do that because I'm a 6% shareholder and all that. If I wasn't, people might go, well, this chairman or board member's doing nothing, let's get rid of him. You need to be able to have the security, I think, to do that.
Just on the mindset of recognizing all of those things you just talked about, when was it along the way where you realized that you had to do that? Or have you always naturally been like that? Or you talked about that being a bit of a self-discipline thing. When did you realize that was the best way forward with some of these things?
Well, I think a long time ago. I mean, I do love being involved. I love to have my opinion, but I know that I've got to manage that. It's a little bit like on the Sydney Hobart. I sit on the rail up in the front of the page at the start. I'm not in the cockpit because I don't trust myself not to say something or do something that would be highly distracting. Right? But I think the equivalent of a company is that with InfoTrack, for example, I'm around if they need me. I'm happy to talk to Steve if anyone wants anything. I'm very supportive of Steve, but ultimately I would never undermine him. I'm never sort of in there sort of taking credit for what he's doing. So I think that's allowed that success to occur without me having to impact other areas of my life.
In terms of the advice that you would give someone in business, what was the best advice that you've been given, or what advice would you give somebody around business?
I think one thing on management, just on that same topic, is I always say it's very important that business is not overmanaged or undermanaged. So a lot of people worry about undermanaging, but they probably don't worry enough about kind of overmanagement. And that probably comes down to that same thing. If you've got someone that's really good leading a business, it's best to largely do nothing but support. And that means that you've got to resist the temptation to overmanage them. And I'm not always perfect at that, but I've probably learned to do that over the years. And I try very hard to have great people running great businesses that have a lot of autonomy. It is very much similar to what Warren Buffett's actually doing. And so I suppose that would be one topical theme relating to what we've just been speaking about, I suppose.
Yeah, okay. No, that's really interesting. I've got, just to finish off, I read winning to the Sydney Hobart is number 6 on your list of lifetime achievements. Having 5 kids, that might change shortly. Once number 6 comes along, it might be bumped down to number 7. But in terms of things like a bucket list, that sort of stuff, I'm always fascinated by the things that people aspire to achieve and have achieved. What are the things, and if you have a bucket list, but what are the things that sort of you think about in the future that you'd like to do, or that you really cherish that you have achieved?
Well, look, I do cherish the achievement I've had. Like, I never thought the business would go this well. I never thought we'd win the Sydney Hobart. There's a lot of things that I've been very pleasantly surprised with. But I think in the future, I'm very, very interested in trying to help the world make the legal system fairer, right? So if you look at the Western world, we have very good legal systems, right? But the trouble is that so much of the population can't afford to use it properly. It's too expensive. And like you go to a family court, there might be a mention mate case that been heard. There'll be something like two that are acting for themselves, and that's because they can't find or afford a good lawyer. And the family court, the worst place in the world to try and act for yourself on. I'd love to try to get it so that the law is far more accessible to far more people. And so I'm very, very interested in applying AI to help with that, which is got its issues. There are people that are reluctant to change. There's also some issues around sort of like, how does a lawyer bill and those sorts of things. But I think that if we can overcome those, and I'm confident we can, then we can really make law a lot more accessible. And that's probably my biggest aim at the moment.
Okay, fascinating. Christian, thank you very much for your time, mate. This has been a fantastic chat and really insightful. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, Leonard. I appreciate your time.